Captain Jake Morrison stood in the communication bay of the UES Valiant, watching the holographic display flicker to life, with static and interference that made his stomach turn cold with dread. The message had come through encrypted channels, from deep space carrying priority codes that only the highest levels of Earth's government possessed, and the timing could not have been worse with humanity spread thin across 47 star systems. Admiral Lisa Carter moved beside him, her weathered face showing the strain of 3 decades defending human space, while her fingers drummed nervously against the metal console that had seen better days. The hologram stabilized, revealing the towering figure of Overlord Vexhar, whose reptilian features and golden eyes held the weight of 8,000 years of galactic conquest behind them. His voice carried across space with mechanical precision that stripped away any hope of negotiation or mercy, as he began speaking in perfect English that somehow made his words more terrifying than any alien language could have been. Behind him stretched the bridge of a ship so massive that human minds struggled to comprehend its scale, while lesser aliens moved about their duties with the efficiency of a species that had never known defeat. Morrison felt his throat go dry as the alien overlord explained that humanity had exactly 72 hours to make a choice that would determine the fate of every human being in the galaxy. The hegemony had been watching human expansion for decades, cataloging their military capabilities and technological development, while waiting for the right moment to extend their protection to another primitive species. Now that moment had arrived, and humanity faced the same ultimatum that had been presented to countless species across the millennia, with only 2 possible outcomes. Dr. Peter Walsh stepped forward from where he had been analyzing the transmission, data, his face pale with the kind of fear that came from truly understanding what they faced. The xenobiologist had spent his career studying the remains of civilizations that had encountered the hegemony, and every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion, that resistance was not just futile, but completely impossible. His hands shook as he activated the holographic displays showing the archaeological sites, where 17 different species had chosen extinction over submission, leaving behind only ruins and cautionary tales. The first option presented by Overlord Vexhar was submission, which would require humanity to surrender all military vessels and dismantle their space colonies, while accepting designation as a protected species under hegemony law. This designation meant permanent technological limitation that would freeze human development at current levels, while breeding rights would be controlled by alien administrators who understood population management better than any human government. Earth would become a nature preserve where humans lived as carefully managed specimens in a galaxy-spanning zoo that masqueraded as protection. Commander Amy Brooks ran tactical calculations on her display, knowing that the numbers painted a picture of absolute hopelessness that no amount of courage or determination could overcome. Humanity possessed exactly 412 combat-capable vessels scattered across their territory, while the hegemony fleet contained over 3,000 warships, each one technologically superior to humanity's best designs. Human kinetic weapons barely scratched the energy shields that protected alien vessels, while their plasma cannons could melt a human dreadnought in seconds, reducing centuries of technological advancement to molten slag. The second option was extinction, and Overlord Vexhar explained this possibility with the same emotionless tone he had used to describe submission. The hegemony fleet would systematically destroy every human world station and vessel in the galaxy, leaving nothing behind but asteroids where once thriving colonies had existed. They had perfected this process over millennia, turning entire star systems into object lessons for species that might consider resistance in the future, and their efficiency at genocide was as impressive as their technology. News of the ultimatum spread through human space faster than official communications could travel, as word leaked from military installations and government facilities to civilian populations already nervous about increasing alien activity in nearby systems. On Mars, Governor Steve Parker began evacuating civilians to underground bunkers that had been designed to protect against asteroid impacts, but seemed pathetically inadequate against weapons that could crack planets. The Red Planet's famous domed cities started implementing emergency protocols that everyone hoped would never be needed, while families tried to process the reality that their children might never see another sunrise. Europa Station Director Karen White made the difficult decision to begin destroying sensitive research data, rather than allow it to fall into alien hands that might use human scientific achievements to subjugate other species. The ice moons laboratories had produced breakthrough discoveries in quantum mechanics and biological engineering that represented centuries of human intellectual achievement. But all of that meant nothing if it helped the hegemony tighten their grip on the galaxy. She watched decades of work disappear into digital oblivion, while her staff worked frantically to save what little they could on isolated storage devices. Throughout the Outer Rim, colonies, desperate final messages began broadcasting toward Earth, as families recorded what they believed might be their last words to relatives they would never see again. Children who had been born among the stars and knew no other home than the metal corridors of space stations tried to understand why the adults around them wept, while looking at displays showing their beautiful blue homeworld. The mining colonies, on airless rocks and gas giant moons, had always known they lived on the edge of disaster, but alien invasion had never appeared on their emergency planning documents. In the halls of Earth's Global Defense Council, something unexpected began stirring as military officers and civilian leaders processed the magnitude of the choice they faced. General Chris Adams stood before the emergency assembly, his uniform, bearing decorations from conflicts that now seemed like children's games, compared to what approached from deep space. His voice carried the authority of a man who had never retreated from any battlefield, as he spoke words that would echo through history, saying that maybe survival was not worth the price the aliens demanded. The weight of 8 billion lives pressed down on every person in that room while they tried to comprehend a decision that would determine whether humanity continued existing as a species or disappeared entirely from a universe that suddenly seemed much larger and more hostile than anyone had imagined. Time ticked away with mechanical precision, while outside Earth's atmosphere the stars continued shining with the same light that had guided human ancestors across ancient oceans to discover new lands where they could live free. President Helen Martinez stood at the head of the emergency council table, her hands pressed flat against the polished surface, while she tried to find words that could somehow make sense of an impossible situation that had no good answers. The weight of 8 billion human lives rested on her shoulders as she looked around the room at faces that reflected her own fear and uncertainty, while the clock on the wall counted down toward a deadline that would determine the fate of their entire species. She had spent her political career making difficult decisions, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for choosing between slavery and extinction, while knowing that either choice would haunt humanity forever. Fleet Admiral Roy Jackson slammed his fist against the conference table with enough force to make the holographic displays flicker, as his voice rose above the nervous murmur of advisors and military officers who had never faced anything remotely comparable to their current crisis. His weathered face showed the kind of anger that came from a lifetime of military service, dedicated to protecting human interests, only to discover that all their preparations meant nothing against enemies who possessed technology that seemed like magic. The Admiral declared that a species unable to defend itself deserved extinction, and his words sparked the first serious discussion of resistance among leaders who had assumed submission was their only rational choice. Dr. Susan Moore stepped forward, from her position near the tactical displays, her voice steady. Despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal to people who might dismiss her research as scientific fantasy, the head of the Theoretical Physics Institute had been working on quantum displacement technology for over a decade, pursuing theories that most scientists considered impossible, until recent breakthroughs proved that matter could be phased partially out of normal space-time. Her team had achieved limited success in laboratory conditions, but the technology remained incomplete and untested on anything larger than microscopic particles that vanished for fractions of seconds before returning to normal space. The quantum displacement research represented humanity's only possible advantage against alien technology that surpassed human capabilities in every measurable category, from energy generation to material science. Moore explained that successful quantum phasing could allow human ships to avoid hegemony weapons for brief periods by existing partially outside the dimensional framework where conventional physics applied and energy weapons functioned according to predictable rules. The technology required enormous amounts of power and carried risks that included complete molecular dissolution if the displacement field collapsed at the wrong moment, but it offered something no human weapon possessed, which was the element of surprise. Captain Dan Foster entered the council chamber still wearing his deep space reconnaissance uniform, stained with the grime of weeks spent beyond the galactic rim, where his ship Aurora had gathered intelligence that painted a different picture of the seemingly invincible hegemony. His report revealed that the alien coalition was not as united as their public communications suggested, with at least 3 member species showing signs of internal rebellion, while their fleet positioning indicated they were stretched thin, maintaining order across territory that spanned hundreds of star systems. The Selenite species had been planning resistance for centuries, while the Void Dancers had never fully accepted integration into the hegemony structure, and both groups might be willing to support human defiance if it provided opportunity for their own liberation. Commander Beth Taylor activated the holographic star map, showing human space and surrounding territories, while she outlined the most audacious military strategy ever conceived by Earth's defense forces. Her plan abandoned all conventional tactical thinking in favor of hit-and-run warfare that would use civilian vessels converted to suicide ships targeting hegemony supply lines rather than engaging their main battle fleet directly. The strategy required sacrificing entire human colonies as bait, while launching coordinated attacks against alien infrastructure with no regard for human casualties, since conventional victory was impossible, and the goal became inflicting maximum damage before inevitable defeat. The debate that followed raged through the corridors of power for 18 hours, while outside the building crowds gathered to demand answers that their leaders could not provide without causing planet-wide panic. Philosopher Dr. Alan Green argued that submission would preserve human consciousness and culture even in diminished form, while future generations might find ways to regain their freedom through gradual technological advancement under alien supervision. His position attracted support from civilian leaders who had never faced combat and believed that survival should take priority over abstract concepts like freedom and dignity that meant nothing to extinct species. Military historian Colonel Grace Miller countered that a species surrendering its freedom became something less than human, while living under conditions designed to prevent any possibility of future resistance or technological development. She pointed to historical examples of conquered peoples who had maintained their identity through centuries of oppression, but acknowledged that humanity faced something unprecedented in human experience since the hegemony possessed technology and resources that made rebellion seemingly impossible. The colonel emphasized that choosing slavery would condemn not just current generations but all future humans to lives of carefully managed servitude in a galaxy where they would never be allowed to reach their full potential. As the deadline approached with terrifying speed, an unexpected voice joined the conversation. When 80-year-old former President Frank Stone addressed the council via hologram from his retirement home on Titan, where he had been following the crisis through encrypted military channels. The architect of humanity's space expansion spoke with the authority of someone who had guided their species through its first steps beyond Earth's atmosphere, while his words carried weight that transcended political divisions and military hierarchies. Stone reminded them that human ancestors had not crawled out of caves and crossed oceans by choosing safe paths, but had always pushed forward into unknown territory where danger waited alongside opportunity. The vote was called at 23 hours and 47 minutes Earth Standard Time, with only 13 minutes remaining before the hegemony deadline expired, and their fleet would begin implementing whatever option humanity had chosen. Council members cast their ballots knowing that history would judge their decision, while families across human space waited for word that would determine whether their children had any future worth living. The result showed 847 votes for defiance against 1,203 votes for submission. As fear overcame courage and practical concerns, outweighed principles that seemed like luxury items when extinction threatened. President Martinez stared at the voting results for long seconds while the weight of her office pressed down with crushing force, and she realized that the democratic process had chosen a path that would preserve human bodies while destroying human souls. The Emergency Powers Act had been written for situations exactly like this, when normal government processes produced results that threatened species survival, but she had never imagined using it to override a decision that prioritized life over freedom. Her hand trembled as she activated the override codes while her voice carried across human space, announcing that history would judge them as free beings who had chosen their own fate rather than creatures who had surrendered their birthright for the promise of continued existence under alien masters. The hegemony response came with the swift precision of a species that had perfected the art of subjugating rebellious worlds over 8 millennia, while their massive fleet emerged from hyperspace in formations that demonstrated both overwhelming power and absolute confidence in their technological superiority. Overlord Vexhar commanded the punitive expedition personally from his flagship Eternal Dominion, whose hull stretched for kilometers through space like a metallic mountain designed to intimidate enemies into surrender before the first shot was fired. 250 escort vessels accompanied the World Killer, each one capable of destroying entire human fleets, while their combined firepower could reduce planets to glowing debris in a matter of hours. Captain Morrison watched the alien armada deploy across his tactical displays, knowing that every human ship in the solar system was about to be annihilated by weapons that operated on principles their scientists barely understood. The entire human defense fleet consisted of exactly 412 vessels, ranging from military destroyers to hastily converted cargo haulers that had been pressed into service when traditional warships proved inadequate for the coming battle. Dr. Moore's experimental quantum displacement generators had been installed on 37 ships during frantic around-the-clock work sessions that pushed human engineering capabilities beyond their normal limits, while technicians prayed that untested technology would somehow level a playing field that favored their enemies in every possible way. The Battle of Sol began when hegemony forces opened fire on orbital defense platforms that had been designed to protect Earth from asteroid impacts and hostile fleets, but crumbled like ancient monuments before weapons that converted matter directly into energy. Admiral Carter commanded human forces from Luna Base, while watching her lifetime's work disappear in brilliant flashes that lit up the space around Earth like a deadly fireworks display that celebrated the end of human independence. The alien plasma cannons carved through human defensive structures with casual ease, while their energy shields absorbed return fire that might as well have been thrown rocks for all the damage it inflicted on vessels that had conquered dozens of star systems. Commander Brooks activated the quantum displacement field aboard her destroyer Phoenix, while holding her breath and praying that experimental technology would work better in combat than it had during laboratory tests that had destroyed 3 unmanned vessels. The ship vanished from all sensors for exactly 12 seconds, existing partially outside normal spacetime, where conventional physics no longer applied, and energy weapons could not track targets that flickered between dimensions like ghosts made of metal and human determination. When the Phoenix rematerialized inside the defensive perimeter of a hegemony cruiser, its kinetic weapons delivered a devastating strike against alien hull plating that had never been designed to withstand attacks from ships that could pass through solid matter. The alien cruiser did not explode in the dramatic fashion that human movies had taught people to expect, but simply ceased to exist, as its matter converted to pure energy that created a shockwave powerful enough to damage 6 nearby hegemony vessels. The destruction sent a clear message across both fleets that humanity had developed something the aliens had never encountered in 8,000 years of galactic conquest, while their sensors struggled to understand how primitive human technology could bypass defensive systems that had protected hegemony ships against every known form of attack. The brief moment of confusion that followed gave human forces their first and only advantage in a battle where every other factor favored their enemies. Overlord Vexhar studied the tactical readouts with the kind of curiosity that came from commanding fleets that had never suffered unexpected casualties during routine subjugation missions against species whose technology was centuries behind hegemony standards. The destruction of the cruiser represented the first time in his personal military career that primitive enemies had drawn first blood against properly equipped alien forces, while their displacement technology suggested capabilities that deserved study rather than immediate annihilation. He transmitted orders throughout his fleet, directing them to capture rather than destroy human vessels, so that hegemony scientists could analyze the new technology and incorporate it into their own defensive systems. This decision proved more costly than the Overlord could have anticipated when Captain Foster's reconnaissance ship Aurora phased directly through the Eternal Dominion's energy barriers, carrying a nuclear warhead that had been modified with quantum displacement technology to maintain molecular coherence during dimensional transition. The weapon detonated inside the flagship's engine core, creating an explosion that crippled but did not destroy the massive vessel, while sending shockwaves through hegemony command structure that had never experienced successful attacks on their most heavily defended ships. The psychological impact exceeded the physical damage as alien crews realized that their technological superiority could not protect them from enemies willing to sacrifice themselves to achieve victory. Admiral Jackson watched the battle unfold from his command center while making calculations that painted a grim picture of human survival prospects, even with their new quantum displacement advantage. Traditional military strategy focused on controlling territory and preserving forces for future engagements. But humanity faced enemies whose resources made conventional victory impossible, regardless of technological breakthroughs or tactical innovations. The Admiral made a decision that would define human warfare doctrine for whatever time remained to their species by abandoning all concepts of territorial defense in favor of pure destruction that aimed to hurt the enemy regardless of human survival rates. The second wave of human attacks targeted hegemony supply ships and support vessels that had been positioned behind the main battle line, where their commanders assumed they would remain safe from primitive human weapons. Captain Taylor led a squadron of converted cargo haulers in coordinated suicide runs against alien fuel depots, while her crews understood that their mission would end in certain death, but might damage enemy logistics enough to disrupt future operations. Each attack cost humanity a valuable ship and experienced crew, but the psychological impact on hegemony forces proved more significant than the material damage as alien warriors began questioning their commanders' promises of easy victory against desperate humans. The sight of human vessels deliberately ramming alien ships while their crews broadcast final messages to families they would never see again created confusion among hegemony forces that had spent millennia fighting enemies who valued self-preservation above military objectives. Alien tactical computers struggled to predict human behavior that violated every logical principle of combat, while their commanders discovered that overwhelming technological superiority meant nothing against opponents who measured success by enemy casualties rather than their own survival rates. The quantum displacement attacks continued throughout the battle as human ships appeared inside alien defensive perimeters to deliver devastating strikes before vanishing back into normal space where conventional weapons could destroy them. For the first time in 8,000 years of galactic expansion, a hegemony fleet retreated from battle, not because they faced superior enemies, but because their opponents operated according to completely unknown rules that made victory impossible to achieve without unacceptable losses. Overlord Vexhar withdrew his surviving forces to the asteroid belt, where they could regroup and analyze the new tactical situation, while his commanders struggled to understand how primitive humans had managed to inflict casualties that exceeded their losses from the previous century of conquest operations. The retreat sent shockwaves through hegemony space as news spread that the invincible alien fleet had been forced to withdraw by desperate human resistance. In the aftermath of the first engagement, humanity had lost 63 ships and 8,000 personnel while proving that courage and ingenuity could overcome technological disadvantage when survival itself hung in the balance. The human fleet had also destroyed or damaged 47 alien vessels, while killing thousands of beings who had believed themselves untouchable masters of galactic civilization, until they encountered a species willing to die for principles that transcended mere survival. The Battle of Sol established the pattern for all future engagements between human and hegemony forces, where every encounter would be measured by the enemy's losses, rather than human victory in any traditional sense. Word of humanity's unexpected resistance spread through hegemony space faster than official communications, while subjugated species throughout the galaxy whispered about the Death Seekers from Sol, who had chosen extinction over surrender in defiance of 8,000 years of established galactic order. The psychological impact proved far more significant than the material damage inflicted during the Battle of Sol, as conquered worlds began questioning whether the hegemony was truly invincible, or simply another empire that could be challenged by beings willing to sacrifice everything for freedom. Underground resistance movements that had remained dormant for centuries started showing signs of renewed activity, while their leaders studied reports of human tactics and quantum displacement technology that had allowed primitive vessels to penetrate seemingly impregnable alien defenses. The Zelanti Council of Overlords convened an emergency session in their crystalline chambers, where the ruling elite had made decisions affecting trillions of lives without ever facing serious challenges to their authority, since the last major rebellion had been crushed 4 millennia earlier. Overlord Kethan of the Crystalline Hierarchy argued for immediate deployment of maximum force throughout the galaxy, with every available hegemony ship converging on Sol to end the human rebellion before it could inspire other species to question their subjugation. The ancient alien's voice carried the weight of centuries spent maintaining order through overwhelming displays of power, while his crystalline features reflected light in patterns that indicated extreme agitation at the unprecedented situation they faced. Overlord Merthak of the Ethereal Collective disagreed with his colleague's assessment, pointing out that martyrs often inspired more rebellion than living rebels, while the systematic destruction of humanity would create exactly the kind of galactic sympathy that underground movements needed to justify their own resistance efforts. The ethereal being's translucent form shifted through various spectral configurations as he explained that the hegemony's strength had always depended on the belief that resistance was futile, rather than on their ability to kill every potential rebel in the galaxy. Creating human martyrs would transform a manageable local problem into a galaxy-wide crisis that could threaten the stability of their entire civilization. Meanwhile, humanity prepared for the inevitable counterattack with desperate efficiency that transformed their entire society into a war machine, designed to inflict maximum damage on enemies who possessed every possible advantage, except the willingness to die for their beliefs. Dr. Moore's quantum displacement technology was being reverse-engineered and installed on every available vessel from military destroyers to civilian mining ships, while teams of scientists and engineers worked around the clock to understand principles that had taken decades to develop. The installation process remained extremely dangerous, with 3 more ships lost to quantum cascade failures that tore holes in space-time itself. But the alternative was certain death when hegemony reinforcements arrived to complete humanity's destruction. General Adams proposed the Scorched Galaxy strategy that would transform human space into a killing field, where every engagement was designed to inflict maximum casualties on alien forces, regardless of human survival rates or territorial considerations. The plan abandoned all conventional military doctrine in favor of pure destruction that aimed to make conquest so expensive that even the resource-rich hegemony would question whether subjugating humanity was worth the cost in ships and personnel. Every human installation would become a fortress designed to kill as many aliens as possible before being overrun, while civilian populations would be trained in guerrilla warfare techniques that emphasized sabotage and assassination over traditional battlefield tactics. Captain Morrison led evacuation fleets to the outer colonies, where civilian populations were being relocated to underground facilities, while industrial infrastructure was converted into weapons manufacturing centers that produced improvised explosives and suicide devices for mining equipment and cargo handling systems. The transformation of peaceful colonies into military installations required psychological adjustments that challenged fundamental human values about protecting innocence, but the alternative was watching their children grow up as specimens in an alien zoo. Parents taught their offspring to build bombs alongside basic mathematics, while teachers incorporated weapons training into classroom curricula that had once focused on art and literature. On Titan, former President Stone broadcast what became known as the Legacy Transmission, where his voice carried across human space with words that crystallized their species' determination to die as free beings, rather than live as pets in a galaxy controlled by alien masters. The elderly statesman's message was intercepted by hegemony, monitoring stations, and spread throughout their territory, where subjugated species heard it in secret, while wondering if they too could find the courage to choose death over servitude. The transmission became a rallying cry for resistance movements across dozens of worlds, while hegemony authorities struggled to contain its psychological impact on populations they had controlled for millennia. The psychological warfare campaign began in earnest when Dr. Green, working with Human Intelligence Services, developed messages designed to exploit known fractures within the hegemony power structure that had been identified through decades of careful observation and analysis. Each subjugated species received carefully crafted communications that played on their historical grievances and cultural values, while suggesting that humanity's resistance could provide the catalyst they needed for their own liberation struggles. The selenite species received data about mining rights that had been stolen by their alien overlords, while the void dancers learned about dimensional research that could enhance their natural psychic abilities if they could access hegemony scientific databases. But the cost of defiance continued mounting as the alien siege of Sol system tightened around human colonies that had been cut off from regular supply runs and left to survive on whatever resources they possessed when the war began. Mars ran out of medical supplies within 3 weeks, while their hydroponic farms struggled to feed populations that had grown beyond sustainable levels during peacetime expansion. Europa Station started rationing oxygen as their atmospheric processors failed without replacement parts that could only be manufactured on Earth, while other installations faced similar shortages that threatened civilian survival more effectively than direct military assault. The siege proved devastating to human morale as parents watched their children weaken from malnutrition, while elderly colonists died from treatable diseases that became fatal without proper medical support. Each day brought new reports of civilian casualties that reminded military commanders that their resistance efforts were built on the suffering of innocents who had never chosen to defy the hegemony, but found themselves trapped in a war zone created by decisions made light years away. The psychological pressure of watching their people die slowly, while alien fleets waited patiently outside weapons range, tested human resolve more effectively than any direct attack could have achieved. Admiral Carter faced an impossible choice between launching a direct assault against overwhelming enemy numbers or watching human colonies die slowly of starvation and neglect while maintaining defensive positions that offered no hope of breaking the alien blockade. The siege had been designed to force exactly this kind of decision, where human commanders would be compelled to sacrifice their forces in hopeless attacks that would eliminate resistance without requiring significant hegemony casualties. Carter chose assault over slow death, leading the remnants of the human fleet in a desperate charge against impossible odds, while knowing that courage alone could not overcome the technological gap that separated human weapons from alien defenses. The Battle of the Asteroid Belt became humanity's Thermopylae, where 96 human ships and 15,000 personnel died fighting against 800 hegemony vessels in 4 hours of combat that redefined the meaning of heroic sacrifice. Ships rammed alien vessels when their weapons failed, while crews detonated their own reactors rather than surrender to enemies who had never learned to respect the kind of courage that chose death over dishonor. Commander Brooks phased the Phoenix directly through Overlord Vexhar's command bridge in a final attack that killed the alien commander, but also destroyed her ship and crew in the quantum cascade that followed. The death of Overlord Vexhar sent shockwaves through the hegemony fleet, as the first member of their ruling council to be killed in combat by primitive enemies became a symbol of human determination that transcended military significance while proving that even the most powerful aliens could be reached by opponents willing to sacrifice everything for victory. The alien fleet retreated once again after suffering losses that exceeded their casualties from the previous century, while their commanders struggled to understand how winning battles could feel, so much like losing when measured against the psychological cost of fighting enemies who measured success by enemy deaths rather than their own survival. News of Overlord Vexhar's death spread through hegemony space like wildfire, igniting rebellion on worlds that had remained peaceful for centuries, while the psychological impact of losing a council member to primitive human weapons shattered the illusion of alien invincibility that had maintained order across their vast empire. For the first time in 8 millennia, a member of the ruling elite had been killed in combat by a species that possessed no apparent advantages beyond their willingness to die, for principles that most galactic civilizations had abandoned in favor of practical survival considerations. The death became a symbol that resonated throughout subjugated territories, where underground resistance movements had waited generations for proof that their oppressors could bleed and die like any other beings in the universe. On Selenite Prime, the underground resistance movement launched coordinated attacks against hegemony installations, while their leaders followed the human example of maximizing enemy casualties, regardless of their own survival rates. The mining world's crystalline inhabitants had maintained their rebellion networks for over 3,000 years, but had never possessed the courage to act openly against overlords who seemed immortal and untouchable until human defiance proved that determination could overcome technological superiority. Selenite rebels used their knowledge of planetary tunnel systems to plant explosives in hegemony administrative centers, while their attacks spread to 6 star systems within days, as news of human resistance inspired others to risk everything for freedom. The Void Dancers developed their own version of quantum displacement technology, using natural psychic abilities that had been suppressed by neural inhibitors for millennia, but could be enhanced through meditation techniques that their ancestors had preserved in secret oral traditions. These ethereal beings began appearing inside hegemony strongholds where they delivered devastating psychic attacks before vanishing back into dimensional space that existed parallel to normal reality. Their abilities allowed them to bypass physical defenses entirely, while their attacks targeted the consciousness of alien administrators who had never faced enemies capable of striking directly at their minds and souls. The crystalline hierarchy faced internal schism, as younger members questioned the wisdom of their ancestors' submission to alien rule, while older beings who remembered life before the hegemony began sharing stories that had been forbidden for thousands of years. On 3 worlds, crystalline beings started dismantling the neural inhibitors that had suppressed their species' natural weapon-growing abilities since their conquest, while their bodies began producing defensive spines and acid secretions that had been genetically locked by alien biotechnology. The transformation process proved painful and often fatal, but those who survived became living weapons capable of dissolving hegemony armor and equipment through direct contact. In Sol System, humanity prepared for what everyone understood would be their final battle, while every surviving ship received quantum displacement generators that pushed human engineering capabilities beyond safe operational limits. Dr. Moore's research teams estimated they possessed enough functional vessels for one last engagement, but the power requirements meant each ship could only phase for minutes before suffering total system failure that would leave them defenseless against conventional alien weapons. The technology had been refined through combat experience, but remained fundamentally unstable, while the cascade effects that occurred when multiple ships phased simultaneously could tear holes in space-time itself. President Martinez addressed the human race from the ruins of Luna Base, where she acknowledged that their species would probably not survive the coming battle, but argued that survival had never been the true objective of their resistance against alien tyranny. Her speech, later known as the Final Dawn Declaration, emphasized that the point of their struggle was proving that free beings could choose their own fate, even if that fate was extinction, rather than accepting lives of comfortable servitude under masters who promised safety in exchange for dignity. The transmission was broadcast throughout human space, while families gathered to hear words that would be remembered long after their civilization had vanished from the galaxy. The hegemony response exceeded all previous deployments when the Council of Overlords authorized use of their ultimate weapon known as the Reality Anchor, which could lock space-time itself and prevent any form of dimensional manipulation within its operational radius. The device had only been used twice in 8,000 years, both times to eliminate species that had developed technologies dangerous enough to threaten the stability of normal physics throughout entire star systems. Its deployment against humanity represented acknowledgement that human quantum displacement capabilities posed a genuine threat to hegemony supremacy that could not be contained through conventional military force alone. But humanity possessed one final surprise that Dr. Moore's research teams had discovered while working in hidden facilities throughout the outer system, where they had learned that quantum displacement could create cascade effects that propagated through hyperspace networks connecting all hegemony territories. The plan, called Prometheus Unbound, required every human ship to simultaneously activate quantum displacement fields at maximum power, creating a chain reaction that would either disable alien faster-than-light travel capabilities or destroy their entire fleet network. The risk was absolute, since the cascade effect would certainly destroy every human vessel in the process, while there remained a 12% chance of destabilizing local space-time enough to make Sol's system uninhabitable for millions of years. Captain Morrison commanded the final human resistance from the badly damaged Valiant, while 3,000 hegemony ships emerged from hyperspace in formations designed to eliminate any possibility of human escape or successful resistance. The alien fleet represented the largest military force ever assembled by their civilization, while their weapons possessed enough destructive power to sterilize entire worlds within hours of engagement. Morrison gave the final order knowing that he was condemning every human in space to certain death, but also creating the possibility that their sacrifice might crack the foundation of an empire that had oppressed the galaxy for 8 millennia. The cascade effect exceeded all theoretical projections. When every human ship phased simultaneously, creating resonance waves that propagated through hyperspace at speeds that defied conventional physics, while the quantum displacement fields merged into a single massive distortion that tore holes between dimensions. The immediate battle proved devastating, with every human vessel destroyed in the cascade. But the shockwave also eliminated over half the hegemony fleet in Sol system, while stranding survivors light years from their nearest support bases. More importantly, the quantum resonance disabled hyperspace travel throughout hegemony territory, leaving their empire suddenly reduced to isolated systems connected only by slower-than-light travel that would take decades to restore communication and control. Rebellion erupted across hegemony space as subjugated species realized their oppressors could no longer deploy rapid response fleets to crush resistance movements that had waited centuries for exactly this kind of opportunity. The Selenites successfully liberated 7 systems, while Void Dancers began hunting hegemony administrators who could no longer call for reinforcements from central command structures. Even previously loyal species started questioning their allegiance to an empire that suddenly appeared vulnerable, while underground networks shared information about successful resistance tactics that had been inspired by human sacrifice and determination. 6 months after the final battle, intercepted communications suggested that the Hegemony Council had dissolved into competing factions, while some overlords advocated negotiating with human survivors on Earth and the few outer colonies that had escaped destruction. Other alien leaders demanded construction of slower-than-light fleets to complete humanity's annihilation, but the resources required exceeded their current capabilities, while rebellion consumed increasing amounts of their attention and military assets. The galaxy-spanning empire that had seemed eternal and unchangeable was fracturing into independent territories as the psychological foundation of their authority crumbled along with their technological advantages. The most significant development occurred when former hegemony research stations throughout the galaxy began reporting successful reverse engineering of quantum displacement technology from wreckage left by human ships during their final battle. Alien scientists working with rebel movements had managed to recreate the basic principles behind humanity's dimensional manipulation capabilities, while 3 species developed their own versions of the technology within a year of accessing the research data. The quantum displacement generators became symbols of resistance that spread throughout the galaxy, while their proliferation made it impossible for any single power to maintain control through technological superiority alone. The story concluded with a transmission received on Earth 18 months after humanity's final battle, carrying a message from the Free Alliance, which represented a coalition of former hegemony subjects who had successfully